This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. You guys know my guest today. His name is Jacob Winograd, and he is, of course, the host of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, which is another one of the Libertarian Christian Institute's great podcast. But he's also heavily involved in the Libertarian Party. Like a real insider, he actually knows what he's talking about. He has a lot of hats. He is the chair of the York County, Pennsylvania Libertarian Party affiliate and the chair of the Libertarian Party Pennsylvania Social Media Committee, as well as a Mises Caucus Pennsylvania state organizer and strategist. We are going to be discussing the current state of the Libertarian Party, the Mises Caucus, and the American political landscape. Jacob, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, man, thanks for having me on. Good to be back.
Yeah, this is great. I guess before we get into the questions that I want to talk about tonight, how in the world do you manage to find the time to be in all of these organizations with as many children as you have?
Unfortunately, it comes at the expense of my mental and physical health. I should be cutting back soon because I need to sleep more and all that. But yeah, I mean, I think the balancing act is a lot of those things just kind of take different roles. You know what I mean? Like the podcast, that I do that stuff during the night mostly. The Libertarian Party stuff, those happen during meetings and stuff, so you can plan those out in advance. And then everything else is kind of like, I take a lot of phone calls during the day, which I can do with my job. I'll be out on test drives or just multitasking while I work and have my earbud in, and I'll be talking to Michael Heiss or Dave Smith or Angela McCardle or just, people in my own state and hashing things out while I'm sitting there wrenching on a car. So, I don't know. I just, I don't think it was intentional that I got involved in all these things. I just, I don't know, kind of felt pushed into all these different things, and it's just kind of organically happened. And I managed to kind of balance it, but it is a lot.
Yeah, well, hey, I think Reed Coverdale put something out on Twitter today about how like real libertarians actually need to do something instead of just complain about the government on Twitter, and I think that you're a great example of that, Jacob. So you have been involved in the Mises Caucus from the beginning, and so I really want to know your perspective on the Mises Caucus takeover of the Libertarian Party. I think that most of our listeners are going to be familiar with the Mises Caucus, but just in case, maybe we need a little bit of background about what that is and why they took over the Libertarian Party, and then also about how the Mises Caucus differs from previous party leadership.
Sorry, I had to unmute. So yeah, the Mises Caucus was founded back in 2018. And I've been a member for quite a while, although I didn't become active and become an organizer until after 2020. But so the Mises Caucus started as sort of a response to the 2016 election and like Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, and then also to some of the prior LNC leadership and some of the shots that they fired at like the Ron Paul Mises Institute camp of the libertarian movement. And, a lot of people were just kind of getting fed up with the fact that the party was just kind of this embarrassment, election cycle after election cycle, running candidates that didn't do a good job at representing the ideology and who were embarrassing, and then also, taking shots at some of our greatest libertarian figures like Ron Paul, like Rothbard, like Tom Woods, and people in the Mises Institute sphere. And so, a lot of the people who started the Mises Caucus, and although this doesn't apply to me, but a lot of them started it because they were, kind of from the old Ron Paul revolution and, were in the Republican Party to support Ron Paul back in 2008 and 2012. But the GOP was never their home. And after Ron Paul left and, Rand Paul didn't really, follow in his father's footsteps, people were looking for kind of like the next thing to put all that energy that the Ron Paul revolution had into. And it was clear that the Republican Party wasn't really a home to libertarians. There are a few, libertarian-minded Republicans that are left in the Republican Party, but they have a hard time influencing anything and having a lot of power. You have like Rand Paul, you have Thomas Massey, you had Justin Amash, although he left, and so it's an uphill battle to get anything done in the GOP, and the GOP, kind of made it, clear through what happened with Ron Paul that libertarians aren't really welcome in that atmosphere, and so they wanted to go somewhere else. They wanted to have a home, and so the Mises Caucus was started and quickly adopted the idea of making the Libertarian Party libertarian again, because we a lot of us just kind of felt like the party, if it's going to bear the name libertarian, needs to be strong on libertarian ideas, needs to be strong on being anti-war, needs to be strong on being anti-lockdown. That became very prevalent in 2020. In fact, I think a big surge in the Mises Caucus's membership and what led to the success of the takeover of the Libertarian Party was that the old Libertarian Party leadership was just very bad on the COVID lockdowns and mandates. Not only were they just silent for a large part of it, but when they did speak, they would like pay a little bit of lip service to the fact that they didn't want the government to do these things, but then basically told everyone like, but you should just, listen to the government because they're telling you to do the right thing here, trust science, things like that. And, it upset a lot of people, including me. So that's when I got really active and involved. And so I think there's couple of different, I guess like axes that we can compare the Mises Caucus to prior leadership or other groups in the movement or party. I think we generally are on the side of bold and unapologetic messaging. That doesn't mean that there is not a line between bold and unapologetic messaging and just being like, offensive or profane or I don't know, words that I won't use on our nice Christian podcast. But there's we'll get into that later, like some of the disagreements that I've had with like people like in the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, but even then, I think the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, I think even 98% of the time or more, espouses the sort of style of messaging that I think is appropriate. It's bold, unapologetically libertarian. It's not afraid to offend people if it's standing on the truth. That's a major difference between the Mises Caucus and a lot of other, a lot of the old leadership. The prioritization in what issues we want to focus on. I think the old leadership kind of focused more on like wanting to advance the cause of third parties, wanting to advance the idea that like, we oppose the duopoly. They wanted to sort of fit in with the, sort of progressive neoliberal culture. They wanted to adopt a lot of the left's talking points when it came to culture, when it even came to politics and economics. And it wanted to basically, it was kind of like what I would call like we've heard in the church, this idea of being seeker sensitive. And that's basically what I think the old Libertarian Party was. It was a very like seeker sensitive, to the point where it was like, it's one thing to try to present a palatable version of libertarianism, but what they were doing is just watering down libertarianism to the point where it was no longer libertarian. So that was, and they were not very good at like being very focused on the issues that we think that matter most, like war. They were okay on the war of drugs, but war was something that they were, often very silent on. They were very silent on economics, not doing good enough job like promoting and talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. Things like that. They played identity politics. That's one of the things that the Mises Caucus really hates. We're against identity politics on the left and the right. And so, a lot of the planks, and there's like 7 or 8 planks that the Mises Caucus has, those are the things that we focus on and we think the party wasn't doing a good enough job on. And then also, I think the other line then is strategy. And I think the old party strategy was sort of this, just kind of, run as many libertarians as possible wherever you can and try to win wherever you can. And, After that, the strategy was a little bit murky. I've often described the old Libertarian Party strategy as step 1, run a bunch of libertarians. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, a world set free in our lifetime. It wasn't very coherent or well thought out. It was just kind of like, we'll figure it out once we get enough libertarians elected. But they didn't have a plan to get more libertarians elected or to actually grow the movement or the party in any meaningful way. And they were mainly, a lot of them just acted as partisans for the LP. They cared about the LP more than they cared about growing liberty or growing the liberty movement. And so the Mises Caucus strategy is kind of like, listen, we're going to acknowledge that we're nowhere close to winning elections at the state or federal level. We need to focus and prioritize winning at the local level, and we need to go after positions of merit, positions where we can enact, nullification or legislation that's going to help to further decentralize power back to the localities, back to the states. So you think of things like defend the guard. You think of things like Second Amendment sanctuaries, drug decriminalization, a lot of things like that we want to focus on at the local level. So there was a focus on local level politics as opposed to trying to make big splashes on the state or federal level, because it's a third party, it's a minor party. We have scarce resources, both in money and in terms of volunteers and stuff. And so, we think that the old strategy had been tried out for a while, and sure, a couple times you get some high vote totals, like Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. They would tout out as getting high vote totals, having 50 state ballot access. But it was like, cool, but did Gary Johnson grow the Libertarian Party and more importantly, the liberty movement? Were there a lot of new long-term committed libertarians? And some people will say there were, but the problem is I would compare that to like the parable of like the sower of the seed in the Bible, where like, yeah, there were a lot of seeds planted, a lot of people identified temporarily as libertarians, but it was like the seeds that were planted in the shallow soil. Like as soon as they had to actually stand on libertarian principles, those roots had not gone really deep, and they weren't able to weather the storms of this world or weather when droughts came or things like that. And so they were like, libertarian in a very superficial way, but they thought they were libertarian because they looked at people like Gary Johnson or Bill Weld, like, oh well, they're a libertarian, so am I. But that's our problem. Like Gary Johnson and Bill Weld weren't great representatives of what libertarianism actually is. So anyone they brought in, they weren't going to be long-term converts to the party or to the movement. And so there's a lot more to it, and I could honestly go on for an hour, but I will pause to give you a chance to ask any clarifying questions. And I'm sure more of the Mises Caucus strategy and what makes the Mises Caucus different will come out in the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. So it seems to me like the main thrust of the Mises Caucus is to present a concise and consistent presentation of libertarian principles to the public, and to do that from the bottom up. So if we're going to win elections, we're going to focus on local elections. And while we're obviously going to run people at the national level, it's those local elections that are the most important. The other thing that I kind of wanted to follow up with that, because I do have some people that listen to the show that might be on some policy issues a little bit more left leaning. And as soon as the Mises Caucus took over the Libertarian Party, you had your very predictable media outlets like the American Civil Liberties Union and some other groups like that publish hit pieces on the Mises Caucus claiming that they were a bunch of white nationalists and racists and all that. So I guess my next question is twofold. How do we know that the Mises Caucus's goal is not to take over America for white supremacy and racism? And then what are some of the big picture goals of the Mises Caucus? What's the vision for the future?
If the Mises Caucus's goal was to advance white supremacy, it was kind of weird that they named the caucus after a Jew. I'm a Jewish economist. We're against identity politics, and that means on the left and the right. Now, that's distinguishing. I would distinguish identity politics from just like in-group preference. I think that people can express in-group preference in a non-violent, non-political way, where and we see that like there are people who just want to associate with like the Black community or with the Hispanic community. They stay in their communities. You could see that with Christians. You could say that with Muslims, etc. And so it's okay to recognize that there is something like in-group preference. I mean, you and I have both read Stephen Wolfe, and we know he likes to talk about that. The issue is not the in-group preference. The issue is when you use the in-group preference and use that as a justification for for state violence. And so, but we're against all identity politics. So, we're not going to advance white nationalism because we don't think that being white is anything special in the eyes of the law. Doesn't, everyone is, put it this way, and one of the changes to the Libertarian Party, its platform at the convention in Reno where we took over last year, one of the changes we made was to a plank that said that we condemn bigotry as irrational and repugnant. Now, the reason we changed it is because the word bigotry has become like a weaponized word that doesn't seem to have a very fixed meaning. It's like if you and I, as just like conservative Christians, say, hey, I don't want to use the state to ban this, but I don't think that it's appropriate to teach children about like 52 genders, or I don't think that it's, biblical for, two men or two women to, be married and living together and things like that. Like we think those things are sinful. You're free to do it, but we're not going to support it. And we're going to advocate for, a more, God-pleasing or biblical lifestyle. We're going to be called bigots for that. Even if we're not advocating for laws, we're still going to be called bigots for that. And be called bigots for a lot of other things that are, just crazy and ridiculous. And a lot of the more progressive leaning libertarians who were in the party leadership would use that plank as a kind of bludgeon or a bludgeon against a lot of the more conservative or even just more like moderate, like didn't really care one way or the other style libertarians who just a lot of us like they don't want to get caught up in the culture war. And so I would agree there's a concern about getting too caught up in the right side of the culture war, but I think it was pretty obvious that the Libertarian Party previous to the Mises Caucus was very involved in the left side of the culture war. Yeah. And so we said, you know what, we didn't just remove that plank and replace it with nothing. We removed that plank and replaced it with something that I think would make it clear that our intentions are not to support anything like white nationalism or identitarian politics. We said that we uphold the rights of all individuals, regardless of their race, sex, ethnicity, gender, or any other aspects of their individuality or group identities. So, it's not like I'm not reading it in front of me, but that is essentially almost word for word what the plank says. So, and we think that's more useful plank than the old one. The old one was kind of more like virtue signaling, like we condemn, sort of like wrong think. And now it's like, no, let's make it clear what matters to libertarian philosophy is that we uphold individual rights, period. Doesn't matter what group you come from, doesn't matter what characteristics or group characteristics you have. Every individual, every man, woman, and child who exists on the planet has, we believe, you and I, that they're God-given rights, but even if you don't believe in that, we believe that there are natural inherent rights. All libertarians believe this, natural inherent rights that all individuals have, and that, civil governance exists to protect those rights, and that we should fight to protect those individual rights. And so, I think that makes it pretty clear that that's not what we're about. I would say some people might have objected to the removal of the abortion plank, but again, it's important to note we didn't replace it with a pro-life plank. So the old plank was basically pro-choice. It said, like, although there's good faith arguments on both sides, we should leave the government out of the abortion topic. And the problem was that kind of left pro-life libertarians, especially pro-life minarchists, sort of estranged from the party platform. Because if you're a pro-lifer and you're a minarchist, well, then it's kind of hard for a pro-life minarchist to be like, oh yeah, the government shouldn't be involved there. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to a pro-life minarchist. And even as a pro-life anarchist, which is how I would identify, I struggle with, saying government shouldn't be involved in it because I think it's a little bit nuanced. Right. So we removed the plank to not move the party to the right side of the culture war, but rather to remove it from the left side of the culture war and allow individual people within the party and our candidates to basically take whatever position they want. And then we can say, you know what? Libertarian Party doesn't have an official position on abortion, and so our individual candidates and party members are going to differ on that. But we're all moving towards a freer society, and I think that we would all unite under the idea that a freer society would make, solving the abortion problem from whatever angle you're coming from easier to do. And so, other than that, I would say the only other concerns people have just come down to like someone said something mean on Twitter. And, a lot of that, even sometimes people will come to me and be like, this person said an offensive thing on Twitter. And even if I were to like nitpick, like be like, well, was that really something to be offended at? Or was that racist, or was that bigoted, or whatever? It's like, okay, sometimes or probably 9 out of 10 times, it's like, hey, that person's not even part of the Mises Caucus or the Libertarian Party anyway. So it's a lot of guilt by association and things of that matter.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about some of that here in just a couple of minutes. But I had on, I guess by the time this episode comes out, I had on Kevin Burr, who's a pastor from Texas. He's a closeted libertarian, more or less, and he's a pastor. So we were talking about what it was like to be in ministry and also have to deal with all of the turbulent politics that we're living through in the United States right now. And he was talking about how his forages into libertarian Twitter have been very chaotic, because it seems like there's nothing but libertarians fighting other libertarians on every issue. Why does it seem like there's so much intra-libertarian infighting?
Yeah. If I had a perfect answer on this, I would probably be able to solve it. So all I have are my speculations, and it's something I've probably done equal amounts of trying to push against it and also equal amounts of contributing to it. So if I'm pointing fingers at somebody, it's also fair to point them back at me. So I'll have to be humble in admitting that. I think that it's complicated. I would say that the Mises Caucus's presence and then rapid growth and takeover of the party has definitely been a major contributor to the escalation in infighting. I think the infighting existed before that, but because there was no actual like power struggles within the political apparatus, the fighting was probably like, I don't know, the heat of those arguments was probably a lot lower. As soon as it came to like actually like taking over the party and changing the direction of it, I think that amped up a lot of that. In general, what contributes to it, I think, is that libertarianism is, well, I mean, I'm going to say it's a thin philosophy, but that's even part of the problem, which is that there's a lot of people who don't believe that libertarianism is a thin philosophy. And so what we actually have here is that there's kind of a battle over the heart and soul of libertarianism and the right to define what it is. And although I like to believe that libertarianism is to some extent an umbrella term, and that there are subtypes of libertarians, the problem is you have a lot of those subtypes fighting to sort of impose their like maybe more specialized form of libertarianism, and to say, well, that's the entire thing. And to be fair, I think that happens across the board. There are definitely, I think, some Mises Caucus style libertarians who I'll push back against when they say classical liberals aren't libertarians. It's like, listen, I mean, I don't want to distinguish classical liberals from like the classical liberal caucus, which I know we'll probably talk about later. Yeah. I have some disagreements with the classical liberal caucus, although some areas where I'll give them credit and agree with them too. But classical liberalism, just like the idea, the tradition there, I think is definitely within the umbrella of libertarianism. Now, it's one of those things where it's like, I think it's a bit of a spectrum, and I think like if you had a Venn diagram, I think that classical liberalism is a circle that heavily overlaps into that libertarian circle. But there probably is some of classical liberalism that would be on the outskirts, like, and I think the earliest classical liberals were proto-libertarians, maybe not libertarian in the strictest sense. But my point being, someone who considers himself a constitutionalist or a classical liberal, I think if they want to call themselves a libertarian, I don't have a desire to go out there and say they're not a real libertarian. And some of my fellow Mises Caucus style libertarians do that, and I disagree. But then you have, on the opposite end, you have people like Justin Amash who say anarchists aren't libertarians. Anarchism and libertarianism are two different things. And listen, I love Justin Amash. I think he's one of the greatest congressmen that we've ever had in the history of this country. And there's a lot of things that Justin and I agree on. But when he said that, I was just like, no, they're not different things. I wouldn't say, like, again, it's like, I think libertarian, it refers to classical liberals, minarchists, and anarchists, and then you have even subtypes of all those. and then you have the issue of people who are left or right economically and left or right social or culturally. And again, I think it's because, if we were to find libertarianism as like a belief in the non-aggression principle, that encompasses all of those different groups. The issue comes into defining aggression and then to defining what is normative economically and culturally. That is why I think the only solution is to promote a thin libertarianism, which is basically, hey, libertarianism is just the belief in private property rights, and the non-aggression principle, and that's it. We stop there in terms of like defining it. And obviously, we go into more detail into defining libertarian and Austrian economics. We go into more detail in explaining how the non-aggression principle is applied in different areas. But if you try to say, well, libertarianism is a belief in the non-aggression principle and a advocacy for like oppressed minority groups or something like that, it's like, no, you're adding something into it. Same with like if you say libertarianism is the belief in the non-aggression principle, private property rights, and a belief in God, in the Christian God. Like, no, again, and I'm biased towards, that side of the aisle, but even that is like, no, like libertarianism is just a thin political philosophy. It is not the basis for the entire, like, an entire society to orient itself around. It's rather the foundation that you would build a society upon. So I think that's part of the solution there. But because people, I think, are bringing different baggages in, and come from these different camps, and because of social media, which just amplifies the desire of people to argue in general, and then libertarians, like, we're very individualistic, where a lot of us are just, we're so into this and we're so passionate about it that we're not just going to casually express an opinion. It's like, if someone disagrees with us, we're going to push back and we're going to have a debate. And so I think some of that's good, but obviously a lot of it can be very off-putting or even like just like confusing to newcomers. And so it would be nice to dial it back a bit.
Yeah, I think right now it seems like the main fault line in the Libertarian Party runs between the Mises Caucus and the Classical Liberal Caucus. So maybe you can talk about the goals of the Classical Liberal Caucus and how they differ from the MC, and then what's really like at the heart of the disagreements between those two groups, because they are, there is a very stark contrast between the MC and the CLC. So just walk us through the contours of that debate.
Yeah. So the Classical Liberal Caucus, they say that they are trying to keep classical liberals in the party. They're trying to advocate for classical liberalism within the party, and they disagree with the Mises Caucus's change in direction. They don't like the Mises Caucus leadership. They call attention to the fact that party membership and funds have been down since the Mises Caucus leadership takeover, although I would argue that part of that is just a general trend that started before we even took over, and that there are other factors that play into the downtrend, although I certainly won't act like the caucus takeover hasn't contributed to it. It's a multivariate analysis that we would have to do to explain all of the changes that have happened. But I think where the main differences between the Mises Caucus and the Classical Liberal Caucus are going to be on how we respond and act in the culture war, what the goal and the purpose of the Libertarian Party is, and then there's going to be some core disagreements on libertarian issues. So to go on those in order, I think the Classical Liberal Caucus, although I have met many who I think are actually not this way in the Classical Liberal Caucus, and the Mises Caucus is not a monolith, and neither is the Classical Liberal Caucus, and so I want to be careful to not paint with too broad of a brush and say all the members are of this mindset. But a lot of the leadership and the active membership do seem to be very much on the more progressive and left side of the culture war. So they are very upset that the Libertarian Party is not making a big deal out of Gay Pride Month or Juneteenth or a lot of these, more social justice, progressive talking points that the Libertarian Party used to make a big deal over. They don't like that a lot of the Mises Caucus membership doesn't participate in the sort of like gender ideology that we don't. That doesn't mean that people are going out of their way to be against it. Even I think there's a lot of people who are just ambivalent to it. But in the Mises Caucus, but in general, a lot of us tend to not. And I think the classical liberal caucus people would say that like they're not buying into an ideology, that they just think it's true. But again, that's like them echoing, I think, the progressive mindset, which is just like, hey, a trans man is a man, a trans woman is a woman. And if you don't 100% buy into that, like you're a bigot or you're transphobic. And it's like, again, the Mises Caucus is not a monolith. You have some people who are, probably more Christian conservative like me and who are kind of, really opposed to that. And then you have a lot of people who just like don't care and think that we just shouldn't be talking about that stuff because it's not relevant to libertarianism. But there's a major divide there. I think first and foremost, I think the classical liberal caucus definitely embraces more of that identity politics mindset that the Mises Caucus pretty much turns away from. The second thing is going to be on the direction of the party and the purpose of the party. They have more of the old guard stance, which is that the purpose is just to run candidates to win elections and to grow the party. It's very party centric. If I were to sum it up very briefly, the classical liberal caucus believes that the Libertarian Party exists to serve the interests of the Libertarian Party and to run and to be as politically successful as they can when it comes to votes, when it comes to fundraising, etc. And we believe that while elections matter, votes matter, fundraising matters, etc., that ultimately our loyalty, like we're not as partisan. Our loyalty isn't to the LP. Our loyalty is to liberty. We believe that the Libertarian Party should be subservient to the interests of liberty and the libertarian movement. And we think we can't put the cart before the horse. If we want to have long-term success, we have to grow the base. We have to actually, meaningfully grow the base in a way that would allow us to have that grassroots effort to where we're not just relying on independents or fringe voters from the Democratic and Republican Party to, occasionally be so disgruntled with their candidate that they vote for us in a one-off election and then never vote for us again. It's like, That's kind of what it's this vote chasing thing. That's like, listen, I mean, obviously we want votes, but I want to get votes in the sense that we get someone to actually become a libertarian. They change their voter registration. They change their entire belief system, and they're, voting libertarian every election, not just like one time when they're disgruntled, which you see a lot of people do. But then they don't, like my dad voted for Gary Johnson in 2016, then voted for Trump in 2020. There's a lot of people who fit that sort of phenomena. Well, they'll vote libertarian once, here or there, but they're not doing it consistently. Whereas like once you get someone to be a libertarian, that's a much easier sell. The third divide is going to be on, I forget what my third point was. I lost my train of thought. The first point was the cultural stuff. The second point was the purpose of the party. The third, there are some issues that we just heavily disagree on. One of the most prevalent is like the like war in general, and especially like this has been very much on display when you look at the disagreements we have on like the current war between Ukraine and Russia. We view it as a proxy war with Russia that the United States provoked and wanted Russia to invade Ukraine. And this has been part of a developing set of events that's happened since the collapse of the USSR. And they view it as, no, it's just a big country invading a small country. And, Putin is just pure evil and invaded just out of like power lust and bloodlust, and there's no nuance to it, and And it pretty much just echoes the mainline progressive talking point. The only thing that I'll give them credit for is that they say, well, we probably shouldn't be funding it. Although they're pro NATO, they're pro our involvement in NATO and things like that. So I kind of think they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth, because I'm like, we can't be part of NATO. You can't say you're pro NATO and pro the U.S. being part of NATO, and you want Ukraine to join NATO, but we shouldn't support Ukraine against Russia. It's like there's no train of logic that follows through those points. You gotta pick a side. There, I would quote Jesus to them: "Be hot or cold. If you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out." I think that's kind of what they're doing there. And you say war is a big one. I think they also they are very critical of the Mises Caucus emphasis on radical decentralization, to the point where we believe in not just nullification and not just strong federalism, but we believe in the rights of localities and states to even entertain the idea of secession, and things like that, and they are very much opposed to ideas like that, and they're also they're not as opposed to using the federal government to legislate things against the states. Whereas I think the Mises Caucus general approach is local is just better, like always decentralize power as far down as you can. The classical liberal caucus is saying, no, if the states are getting it wrong, like if they're doing something that's not good for liberty or good for individual rights, the federal government has to be used to stop them. Whereas I would say, no, that the solution should be people move away from localities that are, doing badly, or they advocate for change in their localities, and we should solve these problems at the local level. And so, again, there's a lot there, but I think those are the three big things. It's on the culture war, it's on the purpose of the party, and it's on the there's specific issues that we're going to have issues with.
Yeah, real quick, I want to get your take on one more thing before we move on to LP New Hampshire, which is going to be, I'm sure, a really interesting conversation. The Classical Liberal Caucus and several leaders within the CLC have claimed that the Mises Caucus has both compromised fundraising for the Libertarian Party and pushed away potential members. How do you respond to that?
I would say that I agree with them to some extent, although we're probably going to disagree along the edges. We probably pushed some people away. Let me rephrase that. We most definitely pushed some people away. But going back to what I said earlier, I think we pushed people away who just weren't actual libertarians. I think we pushed people away who were progressives, who were infatuated with their misconception of what libertarianism was. And as soon as we stopped repeating all the progressive talking points and we started promoting a actual very radical, more Ron Paul, Mises Institute style libertarianism through our messaging, turned a lot of them off and they left. It's like, okay, well, this goes back to my point I made on the last question, which is the point of the party to just fundraise and get as many votes as possible? It's like, well, here's a thought experiment. It's like, if you want to get more money, maybe it's to start adopting the talking points of the other two parties, because they're bigger than us, right? It's like, if we, like, it doesn't quite work that, like, sometimes people will be like, in free markets, like, emulation is a good way to success. It's like, well, sure, if you're just trying to, like, be a successful business, you should look at what other, like, successful businesses have done and probably copy some of that stuff. Except the problem is, we don't want to sell what the Republicans or the Democrats are selling, right? Like, we want to sell the libertarian message. We want to advocate libertarian policies. We want to advocate for the growth of the libertarian movement. And so that means that should take precedence to fundraising and membership levels. Now, long term, we want those things to go up. We believe that there had to be a necessary downturn in those things in, like, immediately after the takeover, because there has to be a correction. I mean, think about this like free markets. If you were to abolish the Federal Reserve, right, and you were to get rid of the easy money going into the economy, the bubble would burst. The economy would collapse. Like, people are going to go out of business. People are going to be jobless. Like, there's going to be a lot of, like, short-term pain. Right. But, like, we know as Austrians and libertarians that we have to go through that short-term pain and get on the right path towards long-term sustainable economic growth. And I think that analogy applies to the Libertarian Party, which is, yes, there has been a downward trend. Again, that was happening beforehand. It's a multivariate analysis. The economy, people's available money, people's time. There's so many factors that play into those things. There's also been just some simple like mistakes that have been made. Like there was a data transfer that was mismanaged. That was again partly the fault of the prior administration because they were using like two like CRM style things that didn't play well with each other and didn't try to fix the issues there. And then when we tried to fix the issues, it just wasn't handled right, and then it fell apart, and we lost a lot of membership data. So again, it kind of like you can put some blame on both parties there, and so we lost some members just that way. Not even like people like repulsed and walked away. It was just a technical mistake that's slowly being corrected as we reach out to those people and get them to sign back up again. But yeah, I mean, I won't shy away from the fact that we definitely, some of that downward fall has been directly because of the change in direction, but I just think that was necessary. Just like listen, think about Jesus, right? When Jesus started out, he had a huge following, man, and then as his sermons got tougher, more people would walk away, and more people would walk away. The apostles would be like, Jesus, man, that message is so hard. Who can listen to that? And but then like the true believers, they stayed because they said, well, where else are we going to go? You have the you have the words of eternal life. And so the Libertarian Party needs to be libertarian and focus on the slower and harder work, but necessary work of actually growing the number of libertarians in the country. And then we will see a return to the growth of the party. Also, we were in an off election year. We're in the midterms. We're going to be gearing up for a presidential season soon. And that is when the LP typically starts to see more membership come in, is when you're running a presidential campaign, because that gets the most national attention. But it's going to be on us to put a good person in that position who isn't going to bring people in who are just kind of like fair weather, moderates or something, who are just a little bit infatuated with libertarianism but don't actually buy in fully. We need a good messenger on that presidential platform who's going to really radicalize people into taking that entire red pill and diving deep into the libertarian political philosophy and having those roots go deep so that they're actually going to stick around for the long term.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire because you were recently in a call with Dave Smith and some of the leadership of the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire. And essentially, I'm sure that most of the listeners are very familiar with LPNH. They, to put it mildly, put out a lot of very offensive content on their social media platforms. But for those of us that are against political correctness and that have the capacity to have some common sense and creative thinking, we understand like what they're saying is not designed to be taken literally. It's making fun of just how stifling the political correctness in our society has become. So but I know that there's been some drama surrounding that. There's some people that think that it's a bad strategy. There are some people that think that it's deliberately off-putting and it might push away moderates. I want to get your take on, well, first of all, maybe explain to my audience what happened with LPNH that prompted the meeting with the leaders and Dave Smith. And then what do you think about their strategy in the long run?
This goes back a while, even pre-takeover. LPNH would sometimes get into trouble over their messaging. In fact, that's what caused the old Libertarian Party leadership to attempt a coup of the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire and to take it away from the Mises Caucus controlling like leadership there. That got sorted out, but it was over the messaging that people didn't like. Their strategy is, again, it's not that there's not overlap with the Mises Caucus strategy. There's going to be, in like that Venn diagram, a lot that we would agree with. In fact, it's a vast majority. In fact, probably 98, 99% of the time when I see LPNH show up on my feed, even if it's like a really like, shock and awe style tweet, it's like, okay, they're making a good point. They're just making it very provocatively. There are some tweets that went out that there's been some pushback from the Mises Caucus leadership towards LPNH because they think it's been harmful towards our efforts. And they kind of take two different categories. Some of them are just the like very cold, very brutal style tweets. Like I think a good example of this is the one where they had a picture of Meghan McCain crying over like the coffin of her father, John McCain. And they basically, and they, on the anniversary of John McCain's death, they took that picture and captioned like "Happy Holidays." And the idea behind this was John McCain is essentially like one of the instrumental key figures in the military industrial apparatus over the last 15, 20 years. He was instrumental in the war on terrorism, and instrumental in selling this stuff to the public, and thus instrumental towards the destruction and of the Middle East and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent Afghanis and Iraqis and other people in that region. And so what they're not doing is saying, oh, we just hate Meghan McCain, and so we're just going to laugh at her grief. What they're saying is, John McCain not being alive anymore means one less war hawk who is pushing to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of innocent people. And so they're kind of making a joke out of it, like Happy Holiday, like the death of a warmonger should be celebrated. And two, there's a bit of like intentional misdirection there, because the knee-jerk reaction a lot of people had was, how can you be so calloused towards a daughter grieving over her father? And to which the response LPNH would give, and a lot of other libertarians in our camp would give, is, how can you be so callous towards all of the daughters who had to cry over the blown up bits of their fathers in the Middle East, or vice versa, all the parents who couldn't even cry over the bodies of their dead children because their dead children were just blown to pieces and incinerated in an instance by our drone strikes, or who starved to death because of the sanctions that we've done over there. And so, listen, that is not the kind of messaging I do, right? I understand that is going to turn some people off, but the flip side is it got so much attention that it opened up an opportunity to raise awareness as to why we oppose war, why we oppose the neocons, why we oppose people like John McCain. And so, Dave Smith and others were against that tweet because they just thought that, well, people are only going to think of us as like cold-hearted. They're not going to get the deeper truth. People like me and Michael Heiss were more like, that's the outer edge of what we would say is acceptable, but we still think that's worth defending. Like Michael Heiss was on the Reason podcast defending that, basically in the same way that I did. Like I think Nick Gillespie basically asked, like, where's your compassion for a daughter grieving over her father? And then Mike was like, where's our compassion for the millions of dead or dislocated and Iraqis and Afghanis and stuff? Like, there's a lot of people who live their lives not knowing about this stuff. It's under the radar for them. And so I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it, but I think at the end of the day, there is at least a net positive, I think, to a tweet like that, raising awareness of the issue. Although I understand where people like Dave are coming from when they criticize it. So those kind of tweets are one category. The other category are when they're cranking the edge factor up to 11, and they are basically saying, listen, there are some sacred cows in this neoliberal progressive atmosphere. Topics of race, topics of like historical significance, topics of gender and sex. They're like third rails. And it's basically like, we will touch those third rails intentionally because kind of for the same reason as the Meghan McCain tweet, like it's going to get a lot of attention, but they kind of try to sprinkle a libertarian message in there. Me, Dave, and Mike, and a lot of others are of the opinion, like, well, no, that is where I think the real line is. Like the first category is like debatable, but I think mostly passes. Second category is like, I think those miss way more often than they might hit. Occasionally, I think they hit. Like what I told Jeremy Kauffman and Reed in the spaces we did was like, listen, when you guys were responding to Nina Turner saying like healthcare should be free, and then what they tweeted was picking cotton should be free. Okay, that's like very provocative. It's like you're telling a African American woman that picking cotton should be free. It's a reference to slavery. There's a racial element to that, and that's very provocative. Again, that's not the style of messaging I would do. I wouldn't say I would defend that as much as I would the Meghan McCain tweet, but I wasn't going to demonize them over it or make a big deal over it, because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, you're still making a pretty strict libertarian point, to say that, like, if you're going to say something should be free, well, someone is going to be forced to pay for or provide it. And if someone's forced to pay for it, that's not that distinct from them being forced to provide it anyway, because the analogy I would use is like, if slavery is 100% of your labor being stolen, well, if you're taxed at like 30 to 50%, that's like 30 to 50% of your labor being stolen. And so I don't know, where is the line of what makes you a slave? Is it a strict 100%? Like, what if it was 90%? Like, if 90% of your labor was stolen, wouldn't you still consider that slavery? And then it's like, what about 50%? What about 30? It's like, I know it's kind of hard to say, what percentage you're free and what percentage you're not. And so, but then you had ones like them, when Nina Turner was calling for reparations, they made a tweet basically saying, if you want reparations for your ancestors being brought from Africa to America, well, then fine, we'll do that. We will fundraise to send you back to Africa. Which, that, I think a lot of us were united in saying that is not helpful.
That's a lot.
And the basic point we were trying to make to them is that we understand your strategy and we think there's some merit to it. But if you're going to touch those third rails, it should be pretty obvious you're doing it to make a libertarian point and not be easily weaponized by our enemies to be able to say, well, now we have screenshots of that tweet with everyone saying, oh, they told Nina Turner to go back to Africa. And now suddenly, usually when the progressive ethos calls us bigots or racists or etc., we kind of just challenge them on that and say, where's your evidence? You don't have any. But well, now Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, some of their tweets are out there and it's like, oh, well, now they have easy things to use as evidence. And even if you didn't mean it that way, your average, headline reader in America is going to see that and come away with a completely wrong impression about what libertarianism is and what the Libertarian Party stands for and things like that. So that was kind of the gist of the divide between like the Mises Caucus leadership and LPNH. I wouldn't say that we're enemies. We walked away from that conversation kind of like agreeing to disagree. We do believe in a decentralized approach, and so we might not support everything they say, but we will support their right to say it, as the saying goes. Yeah. But obviously, it would be my preference if, again, it's a small percentage, but all it takes is 5 or 6 really bad tweets like that that get, by their own admission, a lot of exposure. But is it positive exposure or negative exposure? So I think there's a balancing act there. And although I think they hit the mark more often than they do, the times they miss, I think, have been damaging. I think they have I think they have, to a small degree, contributed to alienating certain people from the party who would have otherwise been good allies.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. So in the last few minutes that we have, I want to kind of look ahead towards the presidential election cycle that's taking place. Really, it's unfolding right now. Dave Smith decided not to run for president, and I think that there were a lot of us that were kind of hoping that he would. But I know that there are a lot of quality candidates that are out there in the Libertarian Party field right now. I know you've had Mike Trematt on your show. I've had Chase Oliver on my show, and in a lot of ways, like, these guys are very principled. I know Josh Smith has announced that he's going to run. So what do you make of the current field? Are there any standout candidates? And, like, at the end of the day, there's a very, very, it's an almost impossible chance that any of these candidates are going to win the presidency. So what's the goal of an LP presidential run?
Yeah, so obviously, we were all disappointed when Dave decided not to run. He was our preferred candidate, including mine. He was my preferred candidate. Spike has said he hasn't ruled it out, but I don't think he's likely to. We're still early in the Libertarian Party cycle. We don't choose our candidate until the convention in May of 2024. And so there can be more people who will announce. I mean, Josh only announced in the last like month or so. Just very recently, we've seen that Michael Rechtenwald, he's thrown his hat in. He just filed his paperwork to run. He's a Mises Institute contributor and fellow. And so although there's been no official announcement that he's the caucus endorsed candidate, I can say it's very likely he's going to be the Mises Caucus endorsed candidate. But obviously, I also really like Josh Smith. The current poll has, I think the top runners are Chase, Josh. I think Michael Rechtenwald, it's because he's a Mises Institute guy. He's going to be immediately in that conversation. I like Mike Termat. I like Lars. I don't think that they're going to be as competitive, just in my opinion. I even though I have my grievances with Chase Oliver, I will say that, anyone, if it was Chase or Josh or Rechtenwald, of the three who've announced currently, they all have their upsides. Chase has his name recognition from what he did in Georgia. And he's been campaigning for a while. He's been on some debate stages before. So I don't think he would run a bad campaign, although I think he's bad enough on a couple issues that it would be an albatross around the party's neck, and it would be sort of the wrong direction from what the Mises Caucus, I think, has been trying to correct. It'd be kind of a step backwards on some areas. And so that's why he's not my preferred candidate. But I think, Josh was just on the Tim poll. I mean, by the time this airs, there'll be a little bit more time. But as we're recording this, just last night on August 30th, Josh Smith was on Tim Pool's podcast. So Josh is starting to pick up some steam and get more interviews and exposure. I think he's going to be on the, I always forget the guy's name, but I think it's like the PRB.
Patrick Bet David.
Yeah, Patrick Bet, the PBD podcast. I think he's going to be on that one soon. So, Josh has been in the Libertarian Party for a while. He's a great campaigner. I think he's very principled. Rechtenwald just filed, so I haven't seen his platform yet. So Josh's platform is my favorite of those who have announced right now. Personally, if we were to, just like vote on it today, I think, my preference would be Rechtenwald and Josh running either, in whatever order, top and bottom of the ticket. And I think that they would do a really good job. Might not do as well as Dave, although I think, Dave has said he's going to support whoever runs. Dave is still going to be going on the biggest platforms in the world, like on Rogan and all that. And he's going to be supporting, whoever ends up getting the nomination. Most likely, I don't think he would support Chase Oliver, but he would support Josh. He would support Rechtenwald. I'm fairly certain. And so, I think it's really exciting. I think the Rechtenwald filing is really exciting because, again, he's part of the Mises Institute. So it's very likely a lot of the Mises Institute people like Deist and Woods and all that would be rallying behind him too. And a lot of those are the old Ron Paul guard. You know what I mean? So it would be sort of a poetic thing to see a lot of the old Ron Paul guard who have not entered the Libertarian Party political realm kind of put their weight behind an LP presidential candidate. I think that'd be a really positive development, someone who's really educated on Austrian economics and things like that. I also think he's a former lefty like me, so he has that story to fall back on as well.
Yeah.
And Josh is a veteran with a fiery message. He's a Christian, and so he did very well on Tim Pool's podcast last night. So although the loss of Dave is significant, I think we have qualified people who are ready to step up and do still a much better job than I think previous candidates have. And again, it's still early. We might see other people throw their hats into the ring. There's been rumors that Judge Knapp had been considering it. Spike Cohen might always throw his hat into the race late. Any four of those guys I think would be absolutely incredible. So I think that the Libertarian Party has an opportunity in these next election cycles to do the things I've been talking about, to get in front of people, and instead of pandering to them, instead of kind of trying to say we're fiscally conservative and socially liberal or we're Republican light or Democrat light, tell people, hey, listen, you're fed up with the rising prices in all the stores you go to take care of your family. You're fed up with the fact that wages have been stagnant. You're fed up that all this money is being spent into all these foreign wars and given to all these banks and given to all these corporations and these big bailouts. You're fed up with the politicians caring more about their positions of power and their bottom line and their pockets than about yours. You know, and both sides have been promising certain things to you. They're never going to deliver. Instead, we have the answers to fix the economy. We have the answers to promote actual peace in the world and here at home. We have answers to fix the criminal justice system. We have answers to, make sure that people are both healthy and free, because that's a false choice for one side to say that, that you have to give up liberty to be safe and healthy. And then the other side, like the Republicans and stuff, they weren't that good on the COVID thing issue. A lot of them also faltered. And so I think there's a really good opportunity to kind of what Ron Paul did in 08 and 012. But again, he was kind of weighed down by that Republican establishment to instead be like, hey, there's a third party with these radical candidates giving, an actual principled alternative. I think there's a real hunger for that. I think people know when they're being pandered to. I think people know when they're being lied to. And if we can get out there and give that sort of Ron Paul message and have it attached not to the Republican Party, but have it attached to the Libertarian Party, I think there's a major opportunity there to grow the movement and to grow the party and to start taking those steps towards decentralizing the heck out of the government apparatus in this country and giving people their rights and their rights back and giving back their ability to thrive and flourish.
Oh man, I love that. That was an excellent answer. The last question that I have for you is how do we measure success in the next presidential election cycle? So, like I said before, there's a very slim chance. I'd love to see it happen, but there's a very slim chance that the Libertarian Party candidate will become the next president of the United States. How do we determine whether or not a campaign was successful, even if we don't win?
The immediate political answer would be like 5%. If we get 5%, that gives us a significant change to our party status. It would secure ballot access. It would help us with securing funding and stuff. And so whoever can help get us to 5%, that's really important. But again, that has to be tempered to, we need to be getting those numbers while staying true to our principles. Like, we shouldn't be sellouts. And the long-term success of the election that has to be measured is, again, what are we capturing in terms of that long-term growth? I would love to see a 5% vote turnout. But if we get 3% and we add 10,000 new members or 50,000 new members, maybe 1,000 new lifetime members or things like that, we attract major donors to the party because they're excited about, the principal libertarian message our candidates put out there. Those are major successes that have to be considered too. And so, vote turnout matters, but it's not the end all be all. Like, Joe Jorgensen got 1%. But I could have forgiven that if I would have seen a massive influx to the party, people going man, I just love Joe Jorgensen, and the message she gave really resonated with me. But you didn't see that. You know what I mean? Some people really liked Spike, and he's certainly done a great. I mean, the best thing that came out of 2020 was Spike Cohen, and he's just been rolling ever since. And so that's good. So in some ways, it's what, the Joe Jorgensen Spike Cohen ticket immediately wasn't a great success, but long term, at least Spike Cohen, that side of the ticket has been successful because that elevated his status and has elevated his ability to bring more people into the movement, into the party, and to enable his work in advancing liberty at, working on issue-based coalitions and things like that. And so there are a lot of different metrics that we can gauge success by. And although that 5% thing is something that I really want to do in the short term, again, the long-term success is going to be how many people get woken up, how many people join, how much growth we see at the county level. That's another major thing. It's the Mises Caucus won the takeover by growing at the local level, and I want to see us even increase more. Like, when I started in my county, there was a handful of us, and now there's 15 people. I want to see that blow up. I want to see suddenly, as we're running, during that election cycle and afterwards, I want to see, I'm the chair of my county party. I want to see my emails blowing up with people being like, I want to find out more about the Libertarian Party here in your county and how can I get involved? That's another major marker of success. It's just getting people plugged in and integrated into the movement, into the party, and working towards our goals. Again, part of the Mises Caucus strategy is like, hey, we're not going to win the presidency, but we can use that to funnel towards the efforts that we're trying to win at home at the local level. Nullification, decentralization, and growing that grassroots community of people who embrace liberty at the local level, because that's the biggest bulwark against tyranny. Like, you look at the difference in places that locked down and places that didn't. It wasn't even so much the laws that the governors passed. A lot of times it was just, were people complying with the laws or not? Like where I lived, man, no one was listening to those mask mandates after like 2 or 3 months. Businesses stopped listening to the lockdown after 2 or 3 months. You know what I mean? It's like, and so, even though something like agorism is something that is usually kind of viewed as being the like counter to politics, to me, I think agorism is a big part of what the Mises Caucus is trying to do here, on top of nullification and decentralization efforts through the legislature. Is, hey, let's create a culture of liberty in our communities. And like, you know what? Think of that movie, the Bug Life, that old Pixar movie, and you had the what were they? Were they crickets or something? And that they were oppressing the ants, and the one gets the big evil cricket gets mad at one of his guys, saying that I forget what he said, but he's like, listen, the minute they find out that they outnumber us, that they're more than us, we're done. And like that is the reality of the situation we live in right now in our country, that like we have a small, like 1% of the population is oppressing 99% of the population. If even 50% of that 99% just says, no, we're not going to comply with these unjust, unconstitutional, anti-liberty laws, they're not going to be able to enforce them. And so that's a major component as well. So there's a lot of metrics to success, but we have to, evaluate those short-term ones, which are important, but also be focused on those long-term goals.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Jacob, that was a great answer, man. This has been a great conversation. Before I let you go, where can my audience find your podcasts? Because you have 2 of them, and they're both great. And where can people follow you?
My podcast with the Libertarian Christian Institute is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, and you can find that by going to biblicalanarchypodcast.com, or just searching for that on YouTube or your podcatchers and things like that. The other podcast, which I host on like once a month or so, and I produce for the Mises Caucus of Pennsylvania, is Take Human Action PA, and we're also on podcatchers and on YouTube, so you can search for that as well, or follow us on Twitter. Oh, by the way, so you can follow me on Twitter at Biblical Anarchy. I know it's called X. I don't care. I'm still calling it Twitter.
It's Twitter.
And if you want to follow the Pennsylvania Mises Caucus, just look up PA Mises Caucus on Twitter, and you'll find us and get connected that way. And I usually can't promote Libertarian Party stuff because when I'm on my podcast, we can't make endorsements and stuff like that. But I'm just here as a guest. So,
right, yes,
if you want to sign up for the Libertarian Party, go to lp.org/join, or reach out to your local state parties, and they'll help you get connected with people.
Yeah, perfect, man. Well, Jacob, I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.